I smiled at Jerome from my horse. Thank you. If you really want to thank me, he said, his face hardening, tell your uncle to pay me the money he owes me. I sighed. Fidelity apparently had its limits. I rode on past the blacksmith and livery and into the more stylish part of town. We were very proud of our little village. We had a tea shop, a linen shop, and even a book-lending house here. If my sisters weren't home or out visiting, they were here, sampling chocolates or poring over the latest catalogs from Michaelton. On normal days, this was the hub of Easton, but what with the soldiers' arrival, it was as if the fair had come to town. I was having difficulty finding a path for my horse when I heard my name being called. I turned around and stared at the young man crossing the street. For a moment, I couldn't place him. Miss Blackwood, he said, quickly doffing his hat, revealing a head full of dark curls. John Bigby. Oh, yes, Mr. Bigby, how are you? John was the new apprentice to Dr. Horner. He had only come to Easton last summer, and we had met at Sir John Roberts' house the week before Marissa and I went back to school. I stopped to admire his cheerful blue eyes. I'm very well, thank you, he said with a smile that revealed his dimple. Would you be so kind as to deliver these to your sister? He handed me a package wrapped in brown paper and twine, for her headaches. I took the package, but I was confused. And which sister of mine has headaches? For the briefest second, he appeared flustered. Oh, well, that would be Miss Jane. I took a second look at Mr. Bigby. I might have forgotten how handsome he was, but I began to think that Jane had never been in such danger. I smiled. Are you certain you wouldn't like to deliver this yourself? Again the dimples appeared, but he only shook his head and hurried to return back to Dr. Horner's house, pausing only to say, perhaps another time. I examined the package in my hand. Jane, as far as I knew, had never been one to suffer from headaches. I wondered as I put the package in my purse and resumed my ride if those headaches hadn't started sometime last summer. A horseman took the empty space beside me. I thought perhaps you limited your flirting to the gentry, but I see now that you spare no one, not even clerks or blacksmiths. I hardly recognized George, freshly shaven and in a clean uniform. You made good time after all, I see. I told you that you should have come with me. I smiled. How do you like Easton? Oh, it's charming. Barbaric, but charming. I've never smelled a more interesting place. Never mind, poor George. You'll be back in good old civilization before you know it, and this will all be nothing more than a pleasant memory. And where are you off to this morning? Why is everyone so curious about that? I was only asking because I've been requested to bring you in for questioning. Oh? You wouldn't mind coming over to the public house, would you? I, in a public house? What kind of girl do you take me for? Oh, it would all be very official. You see, several agents of the investigation agency are now headquartered there. They've been very interested in you ever since I gave my report this morning. I'm afraid I'm booked today. Perhaps tomorrow? Agent Saltz is very eager that you should come today. Agent Saltz, whoever that worthy gentleman is, will have to wait. I'm on my way to see my aunt, and she's very elderly. If I don't get there soon, I'll be in danger of interrupting her nap. Your aunt? And does she live very far from here? About 3 miles. What a devoted niece. Why, George, I said amused, are you doubting me? He grinned and surveyed a group of schoolgirls down the lane, giggling and ducking their heads under his glance. Perhaps a little. No sign of Timothy or Richard yet, I asked, waving to the girls. Funny, I was just about to ask you a very similar question. I did leave you in their care. We parted ways. They seemed bent and determined on finding the seal, but as you know, I have urgent business of my own. So they went one way and I the other. They're probably still swimming in the river looking for the thing. If they are, they won't be alone. An entire squadron has been assigned to drag the river and search the forest for your friends. Shall I ride with you? I'd rather you didn't. But you forget that you don't have a choice. You either come to the public house with me now, or I must come and say hello to your aunt. My amusement faded. Fine, I said irritably. But when we get there, I have to speak to my aunt alone. It's very important, a very private matter. Just the kind I'm most interested in. I was annoyed first because George doubted that I had an aunt, and second because my visit to Peyton House was absolutely none of his business. If I'd been mounted on Spin, I know I could have made him sneeze on my dust. But as things were, I had no choice but to allow him to come. We left town behind us, I in icy silence, and he as smug as a kitchen cat with a mouse beneath its paw. It wasn't long before we passed an imposing gate marked in the center with the letter S. For as long as I could remember, this gate had always been opened. Today, however, it was closed. Through it, I could see the long line of oaks winding on either side of the drive. The house itself was too far from the gate to be seen. That's the way to Steedsley, isn't it? George said, stopping to look through the gate. It might be, I answered coldly, stopping beside him to scan the park. It's a large estate, or so I hear. The largest in the county. Is Timothy the oldest son? He asked. Yes. So if you married him, this would all be yours some day. Yes, I said impatiently, if I married him. I started on my way again, leaving him looking thoughtfully through the gates. It wasn't difficult, however, for him to catch up with me, not when old Mac was determined to take his time. George said, It seems to me that any girl, whether she was betrothed to him or not, would at least be interested in becoming joint owner of the largest estate in the county. You must have at least thought about the possibilities. Of course I had. When you're 8 years old and mature enough to understand the implications of a betrothal contract, it's natural to look at such a house and property and think, yes, I could be mistress here. But trailing the same thoughts were fantasies of filling the place with racehorses and carnival rides. They were childish dreams that soon faded as I began to understand that marriage was very much like a lock without a key. I couldn't have the house without the husband, and though Timothy was nice enough, nobody was going to tell me whom to marry. Just because I was betrothed doesn't mean I was mercenary, I said. I just can't understand why the act of betrothing hasn't been outlawed centuries ago. It seems rather cruel to me. Most contracts carry a broom clause, I reminded him. Oh yes, I remember hearing about that. That's where the woman has the out, but not the man. He has an out, he just has to pay for it. Why isn't the woman fined for breaking the contract? Social Security, I answered. The man is guaranteed a wide variety of alternatives in this part of the world, but with women, well, let's just say we haven't caught up to the Western way of living yet. If a woman here in the East isn't married, she's trapped with very few alternatives. I'm lucky. I could go out west if I really wanted to and find a decent job, but most women here have never been to the West. They'd rather stay here where things are familiar, even if that means taking a job that would never pay enough to build a savings or to own a decent home or buy any of the nice things in life. Is that what you'll do, go west again? I didn't answer right away. It wasn't something I liked to think about, let alone talk about, with prying Westerners. Reluctantly, I said, if I could choose, I'd stay here. I'm no different than anyone else in Easton. The West is nice in its way, but it's not home. You can't be serious. What do you mean? You'd trade the West for this place? Frowning, I said, and what's wrong with Easton? Do you need a list? He asked, half laughing. Do you have one? Number 1, he started, there's no electricity. Granted, go on. Number 2, he continued, there's too much electricity. And Number 3, it's boring. What do you people do around here at night? There's no television, no phones, no electronics, no entertainment, nothing. Some people would say that was a good thing. He looked at me sideways. All right. But will your little paradise be complete without Timothy? I tossed my head. My world hardly revolves around Timothy. But you and Timothy are betrothed, and not only that, you're clearly good friends. Clearly good friends, I repeated with a mutter. We're barely friends. Come on, he prodded. You aren't even a little tempted by Timothy? What do you mean? I asked, scandalized. You spent the night in his arms, and you weren't even the tiniest bit affected by that? Honestly. Listen to me, George, and get this straight. Timothy is nice. There's no denying that. But he's so entirely, I thought for a moment, safe. Safe? He stole the royal seal. That's hardly my definition of playing it safe. I guess what I'm really saying is that except for this one little incident with stealing, did you call it little? Except for this incident, I said, ignoring him, Timothy has always been entirely predictable. There are no surprises with him because he's a man who always has his ducks in a row. I know how he's going to act almost every time. I can tell what he's thinking just by looking at him. Not that that's bad. It's just not exciting. True, George agreed with me. And he's not a very good judge of character, I said sadly. He's entirely too trusting. Marissa, his sister, is the same way. I can tell them nearly anything and they'll believe me. Although I thought to myself, Timothy had shown recent signs of outgrowing this. And besides, I added with a note of finality, I decided long ago that I was going to marry for love and not because someone else thought it would be a good idea. When it all comes down to it, I just can't stand being told what to do. You're a Western girl at heart, Lisbette, despite that dress and those dainty boots. I like my boots. George continued to accompany me all the way to Peyton House, but when I stopped at the gate and told him that we'd arrived, he didn't seem inclined to believe me. Looking over the dismal place, he asked, You really have an aunt that lives here? I could hardly blame George for doubting me this time. Peyton House was a 2-story manor that had fallen into disrepair. It was not that Aunt Esme didn't have the money to keep it up, but she seemed to lack all interest in doing so. The lightning rods were covered in thick ivy and stood like lonely skeletal sentries in her beaten-down yard. The sheep who roamed freely had trodden and consumed all the lawns. The drive itself had sunk into oblivion entirely because the house had no visitors to keep it visible. The manor itself was very dark. At one time it had been in vogue to build a house using black bricks. The fad had faded, but the house remained. My father always thought that Aunt Esme should have refinished it, but he never got the chance to tell her, since the two of them rarely spoke to each other. The cause of the rift had always been a mystery.